Okay, I'm here this afternoon, to talk about spring training, and going to merge the introduction about spring training into spring training locally in Cape May, and believe it or not, even Atlantic City. In 1944 and 45, they used Bader Field, where the old airport used to be, as spring training. Red Sox and the Yankees used that, but I'll talk about that later on. And I have a handout for you, so I'll just wait and won't distract you with that. So we're talking about spring training in general. When we talk about spring training, we normally, again, accept it as a normal routine that we have before the baseball season starts, a number of weeks put aside for spring training, get the players ready, prune down the teams, and get them set for the long, exhausting season. The sites that are scheduled nowadays are, of course, South Florida, which is known as the Grapefruit League, and I'll explain why it's called the Grapefruit League, and Arizona in the Southwest, which is known as the Cactus League. I don't think that needs any real introduction. But before the sport's expansion to the West Coast, ball clubs starting in the late 1880s might on occasion travel to North Florida and the southern Gulf states for some form of getting themselves into shape. But for the most part, most of the sport's early history training sites were chosen for two reasons: convenience and affordability. That was the two main reasons: convenience and affordability. The ideal training venues for ball clubs were warm and temperate climates with minimal distractions. I mean, as you'll see, one of the original sites that they went to was New Orleans, but there's too many distractions there to just focus on baseball. It's a place where players could focus on sharpening their skills and, of course, get into playing shape. But traveling so far south for warmer climes took 3 to 5 days in the 19th century, early 20th century, by boat and train. Many players really objected to the fact of traveling by water, ocean travel, and were sickened by the experience. Most of them were just city boys or farm boys. Now, responding to the time and the financial expenses, not to mention the discomfort of the players themselves, ball clubs looked again to temperate, solitary sites where they could insulate them from distractions that required minimal travel and expense. And again, affordability, affordability, affordability. Now, it may surprise most of you in the audience that between 1871 to 1953, more than 20 major league teams from 14 different cities held spring training in the state of Georgia, well before Florida. If you include minor league ball clubs, the number grows to about 100. So Georgia was the major focus there. The peak years for the Peach State was 1902 to 1917. The most popular sites, as you can imagine, were Augusta, Georgia, Macon, Georgia, Savannah, Athens, Atlanta, Columbus, and a place called Thomasville. Florida did not make its mark until after World War I and the early 1920s. Arizona began hosting training camps after World War II, which I'll explain, in 1947. Now, to understand spring training and the selection, again, of training sites, you have to recognize 3 developmental stages. The first stage focused on finding a warm southern city hub where you could go, and from this site, the ball club would work their way north to their respective hometowns, and they would play exhibition games on the way. The second stage was, again, finding a warm southern climb and spending a couple of weeks there not just going there and then traveling up, but spending a couple of weeks there, and then starting an exhibition cycle all their way up to their hometowns. The Georgian towns in Georgia were generally the major stage for this development of the first two stages. The third stage saw the development of more established training sites that were booked and organized in advance. These sites went from semi-permanent to established permanent sites where there was an established resources and facilities that were used again by the players themselves. The main beneficiary of this transition from semi-permanent to permanent was again the state of Florida and the small towns of Florida, which today have more meaning than they had, 50, 60, 70, maybe 80 years ago. Now in the 19th century, the 1800s, on occasion, Florida hosted some spring training games. But after World War I, these relationships became more frequent. It started with the Chicago Cubs going to Tampa, Florida, and the Indians from Cleveland traveling to Pensacola. Okay. Both sites are in the northern panhandle, or off the northern panhandle. It was only after World War II that Florida towns began to become frequented. And what they did is they converted old military facilities and training sites that had been built during World War II or just before World War II, and they were converted into baseball training sites as a way to attract teams to Florida. Now, Florida ultimately, because of these facilities, would surpass Georgia because it was cheaper to use existing old military campgrounds than developing new ones or the constantly renovating old sites. Now, being a more accommodating host allowed these towns to sustain their services and build a seasonal community around the baseball playing cycle. And once they were established, they began to expand on that and improve upon what they had to offer. The weather was also much more welcoming and predictable in the, quote, sunshine state of Florida. Although I've been there with the spring training games when I had to wear an overcoat and have an umbrella. Not galoshes, but again, you're more apt to have good weather, again, in Florida than you were in Georgia. Now, the Florida connection was inaugurated by the Washington Nationals, not today's Nationals, but the Nationals of 1888. They went down to Jacksonville, Florida. The following year, the Phillies went to Jacksonville for the next 2 seasons. Matter of fact, the picture on the cover of my latest book, I'm sold out. I sold the last book in Cooperstown last week. I haven't got a new set of books yet, and if I'm ever rehired to come back here, I will have books with me. Anyway, but the cover of this book is a picture of Jacksonville and the Phillies sitting in this wooden stadium that they use for spring training. And I'll pass it around, you can take a look at it. And this is the 1890 Phillies in Jacksonville, Florida. So the Phillies and the Washington were the first two to use this site. In other words, if we accept the Nationals and the Phillies, Florida sites have been used for 130 years, 1888 again to the present day. But how did Florida become known as the Grapefruit League? That's another interesting facet here. It began as a publicity stunt in 1915. A famous Florida aviatrix, Ruth Law, was to fly over the stadium about 500 and some feet, sort of like the height of City Hall in Philadelphia, and drop a baseball to a waiting catcher. The only problem was that she forgot to put the baseball in the airplane. And all she had was a grapefruit. And she dropped the grapefruit, which exploded in the catcher's face and in his mitt. And that's the origin, again, in 1915, of the Grapefruit League. Ruth Law dropping the grapefruit to a waiting catcher. I'm sure he was very not pleased by the experience. Now, returning to the ball club's southern destinations, the first team to actually go south were the New York Mutuals in 1869. Yeah, baseball goes back that far. The Civil War, 1860 to 65, gave baseball a big boost and helped eliminate their major competitor, which was cricket. A lot of cricket players went in the war. They were killed or wounded in the war, and it really undermined the popularity of cricket, particularly in Philadelphia, was considered at the time to be the cradle again of American cricket. So they got a big boost there. So 1869 is not that late. So they traveled, the New York Mutuals, to New Orleans. The following year, the White Sox, or the White Stockings of Chicago, and the Red Legs from Cincinnati went to the Crescent City, also New Orleans. In 1871, the Mutuals went southeast to Savannah, Georgia. And over the next 20 years, the most popular destinations were New Orleans, Savannah, Charleston, South Carolina, and on occasion, teams like Philadelphia, Detroit, New York went to local areas like Lakewood, New Jersey, Macon, Georgia, Louisville, Kentucky, and Hot Springs, Arkansas. And with the Phillies, what we're talking about is going to Cape May, New Jersey. Okay. Now, I looked all over the place from my thumb drive, which I couldn't find, and the thumb drive had a number of pictures for Cape May and baseball. Now, I'll have a handout that I'll give to you in a second. Look at the Cape May magazine that just came out, which is free, by the way. You can pick this up at any newsstand or bookstore that carries this. It's free. And in it, the highlight of the book, The Boys of Summer Long Ago by you-know-who. It's free. You can pick it up at any local bookstore in Stone Harbor or Cape May or whatever. The Boys of Summer on page 42. And it has a picture of the 1988 Phillies on it. And in that picture, there are a number of players who are in the Hall of Fame. And it's there. All right, now Cape May is 81 miles southeast of Quaker City, of Philadelphia. Its weather is affected by the warm water of the Gulf Stream that flowed up from the equator along the South Jersey coast. The average temperatures for the month of March are in the mid to upper 50s, although you couldn't tell by this spring, okay? What the ball club, the Phillies came here in 1888, 1891, and 1898 for those 3 years. And again, that's what the article's about in here, the 3 years that they came up here, what they did, where they went, and so forth. It's all in here. And there are pictures, okay? What the ball club would do was they would assemble at the foot of Market Street and take the Market Street ferry across the Delaware to Camden, New Jersey. And in Camden, they got into carriages, and the carriages took them to the Haddon Street train station. And they boarded at 3 p.m., the West Jersey train that operated under the Pennsylvania Railroad system to Cape May. And what's interesting is that where the X is on this map here, that's where they were left off. Now, this is the train station that people would take to go to Cape May off season. On season, they went down to Grant Street, which again is further south, yes, along Grant and Beach Street. So that was during the summer seasons and during their full tourist seasons. But normally the train came in here where the X is. And then they walked or took a carriage or whatever down to 9 and 10. And 9 and 10 is the Chalfont Hotel. And the Chalfont Hotel, which is still there, by the way, you turn the page over, you'll see a photograph of the Chalfont as it appeared in the 19th century. Okay, well, it hasn't changed that much today. It's interesting, I walked into there about a year and a half ago, and I said to the young girl, I said, do you happen to have the register's record? Because all the ball players would have come in and had to sign the register, which would be a great item to have, or at least to see. And she said, I don't know whether we have it. I have to go check. She never got back to me. And the owner of the Chalfont, who called me after this article came out, was really excited by this. And I asked him, do you have the register? Well, yeah, we have them, but no one's checked. So I don't know whether they have the original register signed by all the ball players or not. The odds are they don't, and they probably threw it out. But there's the Chalfont Hotel, still there. Quite a symbol of old Cape May. And it was called at the time the Sawyer's Chalfont Hotel, the corner of Howard and Sewell Street, and it's still there, Howard and Sewell. Okay. There were 3 prospective sites that they could have used in Cape May. One was off what is now Sunset Boulevard, all the way down at the point. Okay. And that was a harness racing venue, which they wanted to convert into baseball and cricket and other field sports. They never did. It closed down within a year. But the Phillies didn't use that, number one, because it was too far for them to walk, almost a mile from the hotel again to this particular site. Okay. There's an interesting picture that was done in the 1940s, an aerial view, which showed the old markings, again, of the oval that was used for this particular stadium. It opened in '87 and closed in '88. Okay. The other site was a ball field that was, as you see on page 3 here, just north of Lafayette Street. We have 16 and 17. Okay, it was part of the ELB Wales estate, which owned most of the property up here. And as you can see on the map here, it's next to what they called the gas works. And I think it had gas works there well into, I guess, the 21st century. They've just taken them out. They now have a dog park there, and they're going to put other recreational areas in there. But that was one possible site, and the ball players were not crazy about the site. One, because of the gas works, and because of the traffic and whatever, they didn't play there. Instead, they went down to where you see the 14 here on the map, 14. And this was between Sewell and Benton Streets. And if you look at the map number 4 here, you can see where it ultimately fit in Sewell and Benton, okay? And that's where they played in 1888, okay? And it was, as you can see, it was less than a couple of blocks walk from the Chalfont Hotel, and that suited them perfectly. So they decided to go there. As it turns out, it didn't work out well for them because there was a lot of rain. Again, the lack of predictability in terms of weather was always a problem, even for Cape May in those days. And the end result was that it was a field that didn't drain well. I mean, they just built a baseball field. It wasn't built to accommodate all kinds of weather conditions and circumstances. So the end result was they played there, but they didn't like it there. They spent a lot of time playing indoors and how to find an indoor site, which I'll talk about later on in the paper. But drainage facilities were not good, and they were unhappy with their pick in 1888. In 1891, they returned to Cape May. Again, they just suffered through a very financially damaging strike season. Baseball had 4 different leagues, one of them a players' strike league, and their finances were in bad shape. So they decided, despite their not so great experience in 1888, to go back there in 1891. And this time what they did was they didn't return to Sewell Street. They went over here to Lafayette and played next to the gasworks. They had done some work on it, and you can see here, by the way they laid out the field, they had more room, and they had better drainage. Not great drainage, but better drainage. And we tend to take that for granted. You know, with modern day ballparks, the fact that the fields drain well, and they have, you know, good drainage system under the turf. But in those days, they just put out a field, and if it had heavy rain, you had bad drainage and you had a bad problem. So they stayed there, they played there, and they ultimately rented the armory from Company H for the New Jersey Regiment. And I've been through everything, and I still can't find where this Jersey Regiment was, or the armory was. I think it was the Odd Fellows House off of Washington Street, but that's just conjecture. But when it rained and the weather wasn't bad, that's where they went. That's where they went. This time they didn't stay at the Chalfont, they stayed at the Aldine Hotel, a smaller hotel, as you can see here, had a screened-in front porch, okay, on page 2, the bottom one. And this was on Decatur Street, below Washington. A little further down on the map that you have here, so I can't tell you where it was, but there's a picture of the Aldine Hotel. There's a great picture of the front porch of the Aldine Hotel in Wildwood. That's not the same place, though it has the same name. Okay, the Aldine Hotel, and it didn't last very long. It was ultimately pulled down. So they stayed at the Aldine Hotel, and they practiced outdoors. When the weather wasn't good, they went to the armory, and they occupied themselves by going hunting, playing cards. Each of these hotels had pianos, so they sang songs at night. The younger players, and some of the older players, made it a point to circulate amongst the female population of Cape May, which townspeople were not too crazy about, but the girls there were. And when they had their pictures taken, this was a big thing for the girls to get a copy of some of these pictures. Okay, that were taken again of the ball players. And then they don't return to Cape May until 1898, and for a variety of reasons. But in 1898 is really an important year. That's the beginning of the Spanish-American War. Okay, and the biggest fear of the press covering this Philly spring training in Cape May was they expected the Spanish fleet to come over and up the Chesapeake to the Delaware Bay and to bombard Cape May. And there's a famous cartoon in the Philadelphia Inquirer of ball players throwing cannonballs back out at the Spanish fleet. The odds of the Spanish fleet even getting out of Spain was remote, let alone come to the Chesapeake Bay and up the Delaware to attack and disrupt the Philly spring training. But you can imagine, again, they stayed at the Aldine Hotel. Again, they played ball on at this particular site off of Lafayette. This site eventually becomes a site of a 9-hole golf course in Cape May, which they played at for maybe 30 or 40 years. It's gone now. They have the new ball field there, and they're going to put in a recreation area into this particular section. But they played there. They got better drainage this year in 1898. But the big thing, their obsession was the Spanish-American War. They probably followed what was happening in the war more than they followed the development of players during spring training. But this was a big deal, a foreign war, and we've not had a foreign war since maybe the Mexican War in the 1840s or the War of 1812. So this was a big deal to them. And of course, we were flexing our young muscles to demonstrate that we could do a job on Spain, of all countries. Anyway, so we played there in 1898, and it didn't go very well. The players enjoyed themselves. They entertained on the enclosed porch there. They sang songs. They went hunting again, and they had a grand old time. I'm jumping ahead quite a bit, but the shore doesn't become a factor with spring training until after World War II. And that's where the Yankees first go to Atlantic City, to Bader Field. And then in 1945, the Red Sox joined them at Bader Field. And you see the last picture here, again, is of Bader Field, which later was it the Atlantic City Surf? Okay. I believe the field is still there. I believe, but I haven't driven in that way to get to the Knife and Fork or whatever, and so I couldn't tell you. Is it still there?
I read where they're trying to get another team.
Yeah, and I heard that they tried to sell the lot, but the guy who has the stadium refuses to take it down, and they really want to develop that area into. I mean, minor league baseball has become a big deal, and a moneymaker. I mean, it's a great alternative to spending all that money and going to see a major league game. And the team that Jersey has up in Trenton, north of Trenton, Thunder, they do very, very well. And they like to be able to renew it down here. But if they renew it down here, the stadium will be renovated, of course. And it's really the site of the spring training for the Yankees and the Red Sox just after World War II. So you got the skinny on that. All right. So Cape May. Is that okay, Linda, for Cape May? Oh, okay. All right. Going back to the 1870s, New Orleans, as I said before, was a favorite site. But the Big Easy had too many distractions for spring training priorities. A popular site for getting ball players into a playing condition was Hot Springs, Arkansas. According to contemporary opinions, the steam baths at Hot Springs was a great place to, quote, boil out the alcohol microbes. And knowing these ball players the way I do, that speaks volumes. Cap Anson and his champion White Stockings in the 1880s popularized Hot Springs as a starting point before starting that northern tour of exhibitions. Now, before the advent of mechanized travel, going south for spring training had its pros and cons. Staying in one site required significant commitments from the locality. The community needed to be a willing partner who would cover the expenses for maintaining the playing sites. Most of the original early towns found it difficult to garner the necessary resources and finances for these undertakings, primarily the cities and towns in Georgia. On the other hand, many clubs were wary of committing to a site if there was no guarantee, again, of good weather and of a proper climate. March weather was not always the most cooperative or predictable. If weather posed a problem, then the community had to be able to come up with an indoor facility, indoor accommodation, a local gym, a public hall, and on one occasion, memberships in the local YMCA. I know from my research on the Phillies in the 1890s, in one town, I think it was down in Charleston, they actually went into a public hall and put wood sidings around the hall so that they could go there and ultimately practice. For these reasons, Georgia eventually found it difficult to compete with Florida, and the availability of those military sites after World War II. Another contributing factor involved players' reluctance to travel. Although ball clubs picked up training expenses, players oftentimes received no salary for these getting into shape routines. Players would not be regularly paid for spring training until after World War II. Okay. I had to make sure I said that correctly. Okay. Many players also complained it was not healthy to go to a cold and warm and then cold climate, which is bull. They frequently preferred to stay at home and get into shape on their own. But ball clubs favored supervised training schedules. Teams wanted to evaluate the talent of their players and to make sure they were in shape for the season. Another problem for these small towns, communities, was the unsavory reputation of the ball players. Their notoriety alarmed prospective towns who were specifically guarded about the vulnerability of their young women. Okay. Young women were very excited by the prospect. The town people and the elders were not. Other factored decisions were determined by baseball franchises. Was the training site convenient, considering its proximity and affordability? What about the anticipated weather conditions and the acceptance of the local population, their responsibilities? Before World War II, without long-term contracted sites, decisions were based on where a ball club get the best deal. During these pre-war decades, some teams experimented with exotic sites. Yuma and Phoenix, Arizona, San Diego, California, Honolulu, Hawaii, Catalina Island, which doesn't make any sense because if they're looking for affordability and convenience, these are not convenient or affordable sites. But they made those decisions. Some clubs stay close to home. Again, College Park, Maryland, French Lick, Indiana. Okay, who's from French Lick? Basketball player? Larry Bird, French Lick. Asbury Park, New Jersey, Tulsa, Oklahoma. But everything changed after World War II. Many clubs took advantage of the post-war air and land travel and took up training sites in the American Southwest, primarily Arizona. After the war, the Cleveland Indians in Tucson, Arizona, under Bill Veeck, and the Bill Veeck's father, and the New York Giants in Phoenix gave the Southwest a try. The integration of baseball in 1947 with Jackie Robinson also created problems for teams going into the South, particularly Florida, with racial tensions. Some ball clubs found it was better to travel elsewhere than to go into the South and invite discord. And a number of these teams had already had exhibitions in the Caribbean. So for them to bypass the troubled areas of Florida until they got all this racial discord out of the way, we find clubs going to Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Mexico for spring training and for preseason games. These destinations were easier because they had already had a history of going there and playing exhibition games in Latin America, And Latin America was also a vehicle for black players and Latin players to play where they wouldn't have that opportunities as easily again on the continent. Southern stateside towns, in the meantime, began to reconcile their segregation problems and expanded new baseball relationships by investing in small stadiums, multiple playing site surfaces, and accommodations for players, families, and staff. Okay. Now, if you've been to spring trainings, recently, you see the product of all this. There's the main stadium site, and there's also 3 or 4 other fields, okay, where teams can practice and play, and they can evaluate talent. So it becomes a multi-complex complex, and where you can, see and watch a number of games and a good number of ball players. With the expansion of Major League Baseball after 1957 to the West Coast, the Cactus League grew in size and stature, and no one dropped a cactus out of an airplane to be caught. 15 teams now play their games in the Southwest. These games draw about 1.7 million spectators in 12 different towns. They generate $422 million in revenue, so it's really a big deal. The Grapefruit Circuit has 15 teams who play in 13 different sites. The longest serving is the Tampa-St. Pete area. They've been playing there for 87 years, going back to 1931. And the Bradenton Clearwater vicinity, where the Phillies and the Toronto Blue Jays play, 76 years, back to 1942. Of the 12 sites, 3 are on the east coast of Florida, and 3 sites are shared by different teams. Fort Myers, you have the Red Sox and Twins. In Jupiter, you have the Cardinals and Marlins. And West Palm, you have the Astros and the Nationals. Here's a little trivia question. What was the last Grapefruit team club who were relocated to the Southwest into the Cactus League? The Dodgers, yeah. They left Vero Beach, which they've been at since the end of World War II, and which is great historical reputation, and they moved to Glendale in 2009. Okay. In Florida, the localities contribute almost $1 billion in sales to the state. In Arizona, the amount is about $350 million. The biggest expense is the upkeep and running of the ballparks. The newest stadium in Florida is Fit Team Park, built in West Palm in 2017. Although they're working on a new stadium for the Atlanta Braves, but they had to postpone its opening for this year, and they're now saying 2020. Okay. Fit Team Park holds 6,500 people. It hosts the Astros and the Nationals. The newest Cactus League Park is Salt River Field in Scottsdale, built in 2011. It seats 11,000 for the Rockies and the Diamondbacks. The oldest ball fields are Lake Com Park in Bradenton, built in 1923 for the Pirates, and Hohokam Stadium in Mesa, Arizona, constructed in 1964 for the Athletics. In Florida, the largest ball field is Steinbrenner Park in Tampa, holds about 11,000. It's sort of like a miniature Yankee Stadium in terms of its design. And if you go up to see the Phillies in the Clearwater, it's about a 40-minute drive to Tampa and to see the Yankees, although Yankee tickets are very much in demand nowadays and very expensive. And then there's Sloan Park in Mesa, Arizona, which holds 13,000 spectators. The smaller ball fields seat about 6,500 fans. Now, I know some of you have already have been to spring training, and hopefully a lot of what I've said makes some sense to you and has some relevance. But if you haven't, there's nothing like going to a spring training game. I know, so you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. Getting there early, sitting in some schmoozing with the fans, sitting in the sun if you can, and it is a priceless experience. And again, it's the best chance to get close to the ball players and see how they interact and how they're competing to make the team. And it's worth doing. Okay. For the Phillies, they have a new stadium, and not new, it's about 5-6 years old. And it's replaced Russell Stadium, which is an old stadium down in the middle of Clearwater. The stadium's accessible, it's worth going to. It has 3 or 4 different fields in the back where you can see younger players play, overseen by many of the Phillies veterans, retired veterans, and it's simply worth the effort. So I would strongly recommend, if you've never done spring training, next year, consider it. It's worth doing, even for the Phillies. Okay. Well, I went there for 10 or 12 years during their heyday, when they were really a very good team, and Utley was a rookie, and Ryan Howard was a young player, and Rollins was trying to make a name for himself, and they still had Kurt Schilling, and he was, being as brash as ever. But it's something to see. And at the same time, let's hope that Bader Field comes back, and they bring a ball club into there so that we can go see a good minor league game. And you remember that was at one time a stadium that was used again for spring training after the war. So we did Cape May. Gave you a background of Cape May. I told you where to go to get a free copy of the article. Okay, and I spoke to you about spring training in general, its background, its history, and its priorities. So I thank you for coming out on a lovely day like today, coming indoors. And if you have any questions or comments?
As they traveled down to spring training and even got there, you said that the team picked up the expenses.
Yeah.
Food expenses too?
Yeah.
Travel?
Yeah. They couldn't expect the players to take all of that. It's just that they were not salaried. They wouldn't get their salary until the actual season started. And they didn't get that. That didn't start until after World War II, when they started to pay for, give them their salary.
You were saying it's affordable and everything. I look back at ballparks and Clearwater, no matter where you are, you see the game.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
Well, that's the key. It's a small ballpark. It's a small venue. And if you're a baseball fan, it's very conducive for you to get close and intimate with the game. Not necessarily with the players. The players are still players, So I strongly recommend it. I went down with my brother. And of course you go to Lenny's. Lenny's is the delicatessen. When you walk to the stadium, it's on the way. And the best breakfast in Clearwater, really is. And they'll give you the Danish to take with you to the ballpark. That's right. That's right. So there's so much to see and to do there, and it's of course it's worth doing. I'm not getting paid by the Phillies. I'm fortunately being paid by the Avalon Library.
I have a question. So we have your book here about the 19th century baseball, and I see it on Amazon. There are 2 copies that anybody wants to buy them. Is that times automatically, or how does that work? Does it contact you?
I'm very unhappy with this particular publisher. My earlier publishers, which are university presses, I had problems with, but they did marketing and they were responsive. Okay, I decided to go with a Popular Press, McFarland, and they asked me. I didn't ask them, and but I wouldn't choose them again. I think they do printing on demand. I'm going to put an order in for 10 or 20 books this week, so I have them to sell at my cost to people who are interested. I think the library has 2 copies. I gave the library a copy, and they bought a copy. Yeah. And Bruce already didn't buy it, but he read it. He read it in the library. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
The answer to her question, that's the last 2 parts.
Maybe.
He puts in an order, they will consider printing another, 50, another 100, but it's,
Well, the National Baseball Conference in New York last fall, I mean, the book sold out. Now, I don't know if sellout means 5 books or 50 books. I have no idea. I know I get my checks, and I can't do very much with those checks. But it is what it is, But the book itself is a way of looking at the social history of baseball in the 19th century. Ball players and women, ball players and temperance, wooden ballparks, race and race relations in baseball, Jim Crow baseball. What else? What ball players did in the off season to make money, and how much money they were making. There's an article on ethnicity. I had said in an earlier book that I called this the Emerald Age of baseball. It was a time when, well, today, for example, the dominant ethnic group are Hispanic or Latino ball players. It's about 35%. Back in the 1880s and 90s, Irish ball players made up anywhere from 40 to 60% of team rosters for a variety of reasons that I talk about, in that chapter. And so it literally was an emerald age of baseball, and it sort of carried on up until World War I, 1914 or so. But so I discussed that as well. I really believe that if you look at sports from a different perspective, it's not so much the batting average, the on-base percentage. I know that's big with the Phillies now, but we're looking at ball players, what motivated them, what influenced them, what their attitudes were. That's what I try to deal with in the book, primarily in the founding decades of the late 19th century, and I think that's the best way to get to what the German philosophers would talk about in terms of Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. But to understand the players and the team and the attitudes, you have to understand what motivates them, what motivated the fans, what motivated the ball players, what motivated the owners, how did they react and behave to each other. Spring training is just one aspect of that,
I have a recommendation too.
Oh.
People who, I don't know how to.
She's on the payroll.
But if you take the map and you go into take May on a decent day, maybe stop at the Red Bridge for lunch, whatever, you can walk the pattern of where they stay and where they play, and get a sense of what their day was like. Your brain takes the rubber.
You're going to have to wait on. You only have a few more weeks left before Cape May gets jammed, okay? But if you go in an off season, I mean, you can make U-turns in the middle of the street. I mean, it's great, and there's no one there to to bother you and to affect you. But she's right. I dragged her. Our next thing is cemeteries and old churches there. I've gotten very, very interested in Cape May for a variety of reasons. I wrote some pieces on the first real black African American team in Philadelphia, the Pythians, in 1866 to 1871, and in doing that, they spoke about a boarding house for quote colored people in on Lafayette Street, the Banneker House. And right now I'm trying to research that particular block and that particular neighborhood, and trying to find something else about the community. Because a lot of these ball players, black ball players, would come down there vacation. That's obvious. And they represented the intelligentsia, again, of the mulatto community in Philadelphia. And they would stay there, and they'd have speakers, and they'd have colloquiums, and then they go to the beach and have a catch, and it's a very interesting dynamics there. So I'd like to get more information about that, but I'm still working on that, as if I have nothing else to do with my retired years.
Do you have a second to tell us about Cooperstown that you talked about?
Oh, I was in Cooperstown last weekend, and I gave a paper on Lippman Pike. Lippman Pike's also a carryover from the book. He was the first Jewish ball player in professional baseball, and Pike was known as the Iron Batter. If someone asked you today who holds the record for the most home runs in a game, the answer is Lippman Pike. He had 5. 1867. At the time, he played for the Philadelphia Athletics, but there were 5 different Philadelphia Athletics before you get to Connie Mack's Athletics. But you could trace the Athletics back to 1859, and they were the dominant team in Philadelphia at the time and on the East Coast. So I talked about Lippman Pike, and the paper was based on the fact that he played in 13 years for 11 different teams. And many people assume that the reason for that was that he was Jewish and that he was like alienated from the rest of baseball. He was the only Jew playing baseball. And that certainly may have been a factor. But if you look at his career and the teams he played for, he was no different than any other ball player at the time in a pre-reserve clause age. In other words, the reserve clause comes in the late 1870s, which prevents a ball player from revolving or jumping from team to team to team to get the best possible deal. Well, he was like any other ball player who was trying to make a living. He would jump to wherever he can get the best deal. And the fact that he was Lippman Pike, the Iron Batter, he could, demand that kind of money. He was also very quick. He once beat a racehorse in a race in Baltimore. They were trying to pick up attendance, and that's what he did. An interesting character, but they're all characters. All these 19th century people and ball players are really characters, unlike today when they're just straightforward. I'm too busy to give you my autograph. Or so.